Martial arts don't teach you how to fight. This is something that I realised a long time ago in my martial arts career, and it's something that you can see for yourselves fairly easily. The way how martial arts are conducted, the way how you train within the martial art, the core of the training is not actually about fighting, because if it was, it would be a combat sport. It would more resemble a combat sport. It would look like boxing, kickboxing, or MMA, or even judo to some extent as well. Basically, martial arts that would have sparring at its core, as opposed to things like kata, for example. We've done a video recently about the meaning of kata and whether or not it's actually useful. Go ahead and check that out if you're interested. But in terms of martial arts, no, in my opinion, they don't teach you how to fight. And I mean, this is just from my philosophical point of view, but they're not really meant to teach you how to fight. A lot of them should be about making you more aware of the dangers of fighting and why fighting should be avoided. I've mentioned this before in a previous video that our style of karate, Wado-ryu, means the way of peace and harmony, which sounds quite counterintuitive considering that it is a martial art all around fighting. But it's not. Remember, the word martial art is one of those words that people tend to forget. It is an art form. It's supposed to be aesthetically pleasing. And so in a lot of cases, when you see someone performing a martial art or a kata, it's not meant to be practical necessarily. It's meant to look good. It's meant to be pleasing to the eye. And I think a lot of people forget that. When they go into martial arts training for the first time, they think to themselves that, okay, this is how I can learn to protect myself. This is how I can learn to fight. And those two things have different meanings as well, in my opinion. Learning how to protect yourself and learning how to fight. They're two entirely different things. Learning how to protect yourself, martial arts do have something to offer. However, learning how to fight, unfortunately, if you want to learn how to fight, then you'll have to go to an MMA school or a boxing club or even a kickboxing club. Something that has sparring at the core of its training. So if martial arts don't teach you how to fight, then what's the point in them? What do they teach you? Well, for one thing, in my experience, martial arts, they teach you discipline. They teach you another way of thinking rather than violence. They teach you something ulterior or alternative to violence. A lot of martial arts should actually encourage you to think twice before using violence. They should make you think, okay, is there another way out of this situation before I actually engage in something that could be incredibly dangerous, not just for me, but for those around me. And I mean, most of the time as well, if you find yourself in a self-defense situation, you have to be able to justify your actions. Otherwise, well, you could end up being sent to court or prison if you're not careful. So those are other things to consider. Is it worth going through all of that just to prove a point? Just to have a scrap with someone? Is that really worth it to you? And if you've been doing martial arts for a long enough time, then you'll realize that fighting is one of those things that is totally overrated in a lot of ways. And it might seem, kind of on the face of it, very interesting or fun in a way. And sparring can be very fun. If it's done in the right way and it's done in a controlled environment, sparring can be a lot of fun, and it can teach you actually how to fight and how to defend yourself. Any martial arts establishment that does sparring is one that's worth its salt. But unfortunately, a lot of traditional martial arts establishments don't even bother doing sparring. Or if they do sparring, it's touch sparring, or it's something that is point sparring, something that isn't actually all that realistic, something that isn't actually all that practical, and it more resembles a fighting version of the martial art rather than actually what fighting is. Unpredictable, dangerous, people swinging for the hills. That's kind of what fighting is like outside of a martial arts establishment. And despite the fact that fighting in a controlled environment is one thing, fighting in an environment that isn't under control by anyone or anything, with no referees, no rules or anything like that, it's a totally different environment. It's a totally different kettle of fish. And the vast majority of people that would call themselves martial artists and that would think they're competent fighters actually aren't. Even myself, I can hold my own, but I wouldn't call myself a good fighter. I've been trying my whole life to get better, but I'm never going to be top level. I used to be fairly good, but I'm much slower now, I'm much heavier now. I'm not as light on my feet as I used to be, not as flexible. That's just the way things go. But I still really see the importance of sparring in terms of fighting ability. And it's really kind of made me realize over the last few years in particular, when it comes to people who do training in a particular establishment, then they go to another establishment and they get some training there, how different the philosophies are and actually how much worse they end up fighting as a result. It's kind of frustrating and annoying how you have a coach who is actually teaching you all the right things and is encouraging you to do things like sparring and is encouraging you how to spar properly, how to fight properly. You go somewhere else, and because they have a 6th or 7th Dan or something like that all of a sudden people think that they know better than a coach who has been doing sparring for probably a hell of a lot longer than this 7th Dan person might be. It makes a mockery of what fighting actually is. And I know that we're kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but unfortunately I've seen this before firsthand, where you had a fairly decent fighter with a good foundation, a good base. They go and do some other training somewhere else in another martial art with a different philosophy, and arguably a philosophy that actually isn't that practical, even though on the face of it, it might look it, and they've got an inspirational or charismatic instructor, that all of a sudden they start believing them over anything that they've been taught in the past, despite the fact that what they've been taught in the past is probably far more accurate. And it's really annoying for me seeing students actually going the wrong way in their martial arts training, at least if they're trying to get some experience in fighting and understanding how to actually fight. Some of them will listen more to the way how things are done traditionally, the old ways. There's a reason why a lot of combat sports athletes don't do things in the old way, because they're not as good. They don't teach you what you are supposed to learn, at least when it comes to fighting, or when it comes to tournament fighting or professional fighting or self-defense. They're actually the wrong way to do things in a lot of ways. And you can make the argument for a lot of modern martial arts as well. Things like Krav Maga. Everyone went on about Krav Maga about 5 or 10 years ago, how amazing it was, how dangerous it was. And actually, it's no more useful than something like Jeet Kune Do, which again was something that was proposed as an alternative to traditional martial arts in the 1960s. It really isn't. There are much better ways of doing things these days. There are much more effective fighting styles than what those martial arts offer you. And you might be one of those people that practices these martial arts, and it's not a bad thing, by all means. I mean, you're still getting fit, you're still learning some basic things, but put yourself in that situation where you have to fight someone, and then come back and see how effective that martial art actually is. But if you want to learn how to fight, do kickboxing, do MMA, join a school, join a club, join an organization that will teach you actually how to fight. Even Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu doesn't necessarily teach you the things that you actually need to know when it comes to fighting. That something like an MMA school would be much better suited at teaching you how to fight than something like a BJJ school on its own. It's quite funny because a student of mine who has experience in MMA, and they recently tried out a little bit of BJJ as well in a traditional BJJ school, how actually the things that they are teaching there in the BJJ school are the exact opposite of what they were taught in the MMA school. And it's all because you're not just grappling. When you're in a fight, you're not just grappling. You are throwing punches, you're throwing kicks, you're throwing elbows, knees. There's so much more to think about. And where MMA forces you to think about all of those little things that you might not expect, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu doesn't have any of that. It's like, for example, takedowns. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a lot of the time you start on the ground. That's not how the vast majority of fights start. The vast majority of fights, if not all fights, start standing up. And I've heard that phrase before, how all fights start standing up, but like 90% of fights end up on the ground. That's actually not true. The vast majority of fights remain standing up for the vast majority until someone gets too tired to throw any more punches, and that's when it ends up going to the ground. And so the whole grappling BJJ is more used as a last resort. So in that instance, you'd need something like wrestling. You need to have a background in wrestling to be able to take someone down, to be able to use those Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. And that is with no gi as well. Of course, a lot of BJJ is taught with a gi still. And that is impractical. You wouldn't be wearing a gi when you're out and about, would you? So how can you rely on half of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques if you need a gi to be able to do them properly? It's just all these little things that, unfortunately, as much as martial arts want you to think that they are about fighting, and they want you to think that this is the best way to beat someone, this is the best way to defend yourself, then the vast majority of cases, unfortunately, it isn't. And there's so many people that have this delusional point of view. And bearing in mind, I've done karate and kickboxing for a very long time now. And the more I learn, the more I realize how impractical and how useless the vast majority of things that are taught in even martial arts that are considered quite young. Most of it is useless. There are certain things you can take away. Of course, there are lots of things you can take away from even something like Aikido, which has had a lot of stick over the years for being totally impractical. And I totally agree. For the most part, Aikido is absolutely useless in fighting situations. However, if you've practiced a little bit, there are little things that you can take away that may actually help, rather than something that is really flamboyant or really complicated. Take away the simple things, the things that are really straightforward to understand and repeat. And when it comes to fighting, that whole repetitiveness, that discipline, that repetitiveness is what you need to practice the things that are actually useful, rather than doing something that is intricate or really complicated. It takes a long time to prepare, that takes a long time for you to get into position. Remember, you're never guaranteed to get the position that you want in a fight, thanks to the unpredictable nature of fighting. So, martial arts, in a nutshell, they don't teach you how to fight. They will teach you certain things that might be applicable in fighting. I mean, if you don't take anything away from karate, then take away how they throw a punch. They throw a pretty effective punch, and they throw some pretty effective kicks. But even in karate, your hand is by your hip. Your punches are thrown from the hip. That isn't practical. You look at boxing, you look at kickboxing, you look at MMA, punches are thrown from the shoulder or from the cheek, depending on where your guard is. That is the way how fighting is done. That is the proper way to do fighting. And even if you have a look at UFC 1 or UFC 2 from back in the day, where they've got all these different martial arts styles, well, they all pretty much ended up fighting the same way, which is hilarious. They all had a very similar guard, they all had a very similar stance, and all that traditional stuff just went right out the window because it's not necessary, and it's not practical, and it can't be used in the vast majority of circumstances. And so you end up with this awful situation where people have this false sense of security, even like get into something like a black belt, for example, in any martial art. They think that they're invincible, when actually it should teach you the exact opposite of that, how vulnerable you really are. And if you want to learn how to fight, if you take anything away from this video, if you're doing a martial art, a traditional martial art, if you're doing Wing Chun, if you're doing Kung Fu, if you're doing karate, if you're doing, I don't know, Jeet Kune Do, if you're doing Krav Maga, if you're doing what other traditional martial arts out there, any traditional martial art, if you're doing those kinds of things and you want to learn how to fight, then walk away. Go to an establishment that will teach you how to fight. And the only unfortunate thing is that a lot of these places that teach you how to fight, they're pretty hardcore. They have heavy sparring. They only do heavy sparring for the most part. And it's almost like a baptism of fire in a lot of ways, where it's almost like you've got to survive more than anything else. And you see this in boxing gyms, you see this in kickboxing gyms, and you also see this in MMA schools as well. So just one other thing to keep in mind, us as an establishment, Nova Combat, we only like to use light to medium contact sparring because, as I've mentioned in a previous video, heavy sparring can put people off for one, but it doesn't necessarily teach you an awful lot. You can learn just as much from light to medium contact sparring as you can from heavy contact sparring. The only real difference is throwing a heavy punch or taking a heavy punch, of course, isn't one of those things that you are going to experience. But having said that, when people are in the moment, when people are fighting, even in light contact to medium contact, you'll see some heavy-handed punches or heavy kicks being thrown. And it's not necessarily deliberate. It's because someone's trying to protect themselves. And naturally, when they do, they'll throw a little bit heavier. And that is fine for me. I don't intervene in those situations because that is all part of the learning experience. If someone has to do that in a situation, it's probably because they needed to do it to try and protect themselves, but also the person receiving it still learns what it feels like. So this is why heavy contact sparring, from our point of view, isn't really necessary, especially because we are, for the most part, we are hobbyists rather than serious competitive combat sports athletes. That's not really what we're about. We're more for the average person, someone who's trying to get started in martial arts. But I mean, that is something that I've been wanting to get into more and more recently, is more of that elite level, more of that amateur level, training athletes for those more competitive environments. But I mean, we'll see in future if that comes to fruition at all. I'm not sure. We'll have a look and I'll report back to you then maybe. But just keep this in mind. If you're practicing a martial art, don't think that it is for fighting purposes. It's not. It's for well-being. It's for lifestyle. It's for discipline. And training is good regardless, all right? Having some good training with a good instructor who can motivate you, who can teach you things that you never knew, who's able to expand your horizons as well, rather than just stick narrowly to a traditional martial arts syllabus. He's able actually to explain to you, okay, this is how things are done in the old ways, but this is how it's progressed. This is why things are done now the way they are compared to the way they were. Someone who is able to do that is probably a good coach, and they're probably worth sticking by because they're willing to do the legwork as well. If they don't quite understand something, they're willing to go out of their way to learn it and bring it back into their own school to teach their own students. If it's something that works, if it's something that is good, then they will teach their own students that. You don't necessarily have to go to other schools to learn this stuff, and your martial arts instructor should be able to separate the bullshit from the stuff that is actually good, the stuff that's actually decent. But that's just my take on it. You let me know down in the comment section below what you think. You know, have you been doing a traditional martial art for a long time, and how do you feel about it? Let me know down in the comment section below. Do you feel like you can be a competent fighter? Do you think that you could hold your own against someone who has been practicing something like MMA for even just a few years training in something like kickboxing or MMA? Is quite effective for the vast majority of people because a lot of it is really simple. It's the simple stuff that works. That is, when it comes down to it, fighting, the simpler you can make something, the easier it is to execute, well, the better it is, the more practical it is in the vast majority of circumstances. But anyway, you let me know down in the comment section what you think. As always, leave that like, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell as well, and we will catch you all in the next video. Take care.